We're only a few days into the new year, and already we're talking about Venezuela. We're talking about companies in the U.S. and the president wanting to get that oil out of Venezuela. There's the pushback from the president and the Department of Justice on Fed Chair Jay Powell and the Federal Reserve. A busy few days to start the year?
Yeah, absolutely. Great to see you, Carol and Tim. And I feel like it's been 2 months worth of news in the first 2 weeks of the new year. So definitely trying to keep track of it all. As you talked about at the top of the show, a little bit of a surprise, I think, that the Supreme Court did not rule on the Trump tariffs. That's something that now it's almost like a parlor game here in town. Is it going to be today? Is it going to be today? So I guess we're going to wait until next week and see where that heads.
I mean, is the president creating a good or bad environment for American business? Like, what is it that you keep hearing?
Yeah, I think that the hard thing with this president, and I'm not saying this flippantly, but he just says a lot of stuff over the course of any one day, whether that's in speeches where he goes off script or in impromptu news conferences or over social media. There's just a lot to absorb every day, and I think companies are doing a better job. CEOs are doing a better job at maybe not reacting to every little thing, and trying to find where are the places we can work with the administration, to work with the White House, and not sort of overreact to every single pronouncement that comes out, because not every single pronouncement that comes out sort of amounts to anything. So I think that's the trick that is, people are getting better at navigating that.
Well, certainly not apples to apples, but I feel like we're doing the same thing. I mean, there's a lot that comes at us, and I think we're really tasked with trying to determine what really matters to investors longer term. So when it comes to things like capping credit card fees or Venezuela and having oil industry execs there and, talking about investing and recreating and rebuilding the infrastructure in Venezuela, I could just go kind of on and on the tariffs. How do you figure out, with all of that's dumped on us on a daily basis, what really matters, what we should be focusing on? Maybe it's not the shiny thing, but maybe it's something much more substantial. What are the substantial things that you think corporate CEOs should be keeping an eye on when it comes to this White House?
Well, look, I don't think there's any question that the markets are very, very interested in the Fed independence issue and the situation with Fed Chair Jerome Powell. But even larger than that, obviously, we have a successor to Powell coming up, and potentially other changes to the board. Stephen Myron's term, which is very abbreviated, his term ends at the end of January. So we'll have to see whether he stays on or whether the president appoints someone else to that. But I think the question of Fed independence is absolutely critical for the markets. You've seen what happened over the last few days, maybe kind of come back to the White House and not the way they expected. A lot of pushback from a lot of different people, both
Mike,
here in
do
the
you
U.S.
think
and internationally.
When the president consistently criticizes Fed Chair Jay Powell, that's just bark, or do you think there's bite to it in terms of what he wants in a Fed chair and what he's going to present in a Fed chair?
Yeah, I think he's frustrated. There's no question he's frustrated that he thinks rates should be lower and that he thinks Jay Powell is sort of the driver of that. And I think we're going to get a successor chair from whoever he chooses out of the kind of 4 finalists, it appears, that we have. I think we'll get someone who is probably at least more interested in doing what the president wants in terms of rates. But I think the thing to remember is that this is a 12-member committee that votes, and the chair is just one vote. So I don't think that putting in a chair that maybe is a little bit of a different mindset than Powell is necessarily going to mean rates are going to go down all of a sudden. So I think that's the important thing to keep in mind, that it is a committee that's going to make a group decision based on the data, and I don't expect dramatic changes no matter who he chooses as chair.
But there are certain things that have to happen between now and then, Mike, and that includes, at least according to Senator Tom Tillis of North Carolina, Republican, the president backing off and the DOJ backing off its legal threats against Fed Chair Jay Powell. Senator Lisa Murkowski supports Senator Tom Tillis' decision to vote against any nominees to the Fed in the Senate Banking Committee in response to that DOJ probe into Jay Powell. So we have to see movement there, it sounds like, before we even see movement for the next Fed chair.
Well, and I think that's right. I think you have to keep in mind, and sometimes I think the president forgets this, but that Congress has a role to play in a lot of these issues. And I think on for example, on another issue, the capping of credit card interest rates, you've seen some pretty high level of skepticism on Capitol Hill. And of course, it's Capitol Hill that will ultimately have to decide how to proceed on that. So I think the Fed chair is another place where whoever he nominates has to go through the Senate Banking Committee, has to get a vote by the full Senate, and they have some ability to hold that up, as Tillis talked about and as others have talked about. So we'll see where the investigation goes. But I venture to say that this has not played out in the way that the White House maybe anticipated it would, and wouldn't be surprised if we saw maybe a little bit of a backing down at some point we heard in the near future.
Yeah, we heard the word backfire quite a bit over the last couple of days in terms of the way that this has played out.
Yeah, that's what's interesting, right? And we know the president will say things and then he kind of backpedals or comes back, on different issues. But I do wonder how that can be, kind of just prevent executives from making decisions because they either don't want to pop up on the White House's radar or they're just not quite sure what ultimately sticks in terms of policy or oversight from the White House.
Oh, I think there's no question that makes it more difficult. I mean, certainly the tariff situation is a great example of that. Mm-hmm. Are they going to be on? Are they going to be off? Are there going to be refunds? And we're months and months into this debate, and knowing that this court case was coming. So I think that makes things difficult. I think longer term planning is clearly harder, but I think executives are finding a path forward and sort of picking and choosing their battles and trying to communicate with the White House to not just go out on TV and bash something that the president said, but to find, is there a place of common ground that we can work towards? And I think executives are doing a much better job at that than maybe they were 6 or 8 months ago.
We're talking with Mike Townsend, Managing Director of Legislative and Regulatory Affairs for Charles Schwab. He's in our Bloomberg Washington, D.C. bureau. Mike, though, when a CEO does speak out, and I think about what happened with the oil executives around the table at the White House and the Exxon CEO who talked about Venezuela being uninvestable and kind of the pushback. I guess this is stupid, naive, but here I go. Why aren't more CEOs speaking up? I think it was kind of shocking to see Jay Powell on a video pushing back. Who'd have thunk? But I do wonder, why are they so fearful of retribution from the White House?
Well, I think it just doesn't benefit, your company to necessarily be in the headlines for a couple days, and so I think that's what a lot of executives are thinking about.
But isn't there some honesty, right? Like I think about the Exxon CEO of being honest and saying,
yeah, Darren Woods said that on Friday at that roundtable that we broadcast.
Like if you're a shareholder in a publicly held company, you want your CEOs to be transparent and honest about something that could mean investing money in something that doesn't ultimately pay off because it already hasn't. So I'm just trying to understand, that aspect of it.
Well, I do think the Venezuela situation in particular is a pretty unique one for the oil companies. They have a long history. They have lots of losses there. They have years and years of an unstable infrastructure and unstable environment. I'm not surprised that they're skeptical about the situation. And I think particularly with Venezuela, I don't think there's too much disagreement that Maduro was a bad guy, that he had to go. The question is, what happens from here? Mm-hmm. What does it mean that we are running Venezuela? How long is that going to happen? Are we going to end up with troops on the ground? So I think there's just a lot of uncertainty there. And, I'm not surprised that some executives said, kind of hang on, let's wait and see how this plays out before I commit to anything, 4 days after this has all gone down. I do think you mentioned earlier the video from Fed Chair Jerome Powell. I thought that was pretty interesting, as you did, because he has taken all the provocations, all the name calling over the last really 12 months and just kind of let it roll off his back until now. And I thought that was pretty significant that he made that statement.
Mike, to that point, just in 30 seconds, the last 30 seconds we have with you, the markets have been letting all this roll off its back. Whether we're talking about the equity market or the bond market, we're seeing some losses in equities today and yesterday, but it's pretty minimal, I think, given what's happened over the last few days. Very briefly, when does this rhetoric start to affect the markets negatively?
Yeah, I think, again, I think the markets looked at this Fed situation, seeing the widespread, different perspectives of commentary on the Hill about concern, and said, okay, maybe don't have to be too worried about this right now. Again, I think the markets, sort of like we were talking about with executives, are doing a better job at maybe not reacting to every little thing that comes out, and hopefully we'll continue to do that.